Good evening, it's John Heaton, and had a couple of requests to do early Beatles albums, so I'm going to do this one, the debut, released on the 22nd of March 1963. Quite a lot to be said for this album. Before I go through the tracks, I'm just going to tell you a few interesting bits of information. Tony Barrow wrote the sleeve notes, and quite interesting what he wrote, because quite prophetic really. He says, no other team had joined the bestsellers via a debut disc, talking about Love Me Do, but the Beatles were history makers from the start, and Love Me Do sold enough copies during its first 48 hours in the shops to send it soaring into the national charts. It's not the only time Tony Barrow would say something prophetic about Beatles making history, even as early as 63. I think he said it on a couple of EP covers as well. Something to the tune of, in 30 years' time, I bet you people are still listening to this, or something like that, which is quite a brave thing to say, considering they were such a new band. And then another sentence here, he says, their own built-in tunesmith team of John Lennon and Paul McCartney has already tucked away enough self-penned numbers to maintain a steady output of all original singles from now until 1975. Well, I know they wrote a lot of early stuff together, but I counted up the songs I could think of which had been written by the time this album came out, which later appeared on an official Beatles album, and I counted 6. From Me to You and Thank You Girl, the single which came out 3 weeks after this album. Hold Me Tight, which was recorded for this album but not used, and then re-recorded with the Beatles. I'll Follow the Sun, which was written pretty early on by Paul when he was a teenager, early teens I think, and then recorded for Beatles for Sale. When I'm 64, another early McCartney number, which they used to perform in Hamburg when the guitars broke and the amps broke down. McCartney did it on the piano. That turned up on Sgt. Pepper. And then the 6th one is One After 909, which was recorded on the 5th of March, so a couple of weeks before this album came out, and finally turned up on, re-recorded on Let It Be in 69. And then if you count I'll Be On My Way, which was recorded for the BBC around about 63 as well. That's another Lennon-McCartney original. But mostly they wrote new songs as each new album came out, and I think they regarded their early compositions as not being up to scratch. On Anthology you can see quite a few of their early compositions, and they're not really that outstanding. But back to this album, what else can we say about it? This is a great cover from Angus MacBean, taken at Manchester House in London, the EMI headquarters, and of course replicated 6 years later by the intended sleeve for Get Back, which ended up as Let It Be, and then this picture was used for the Red and Blue album along with a variant of this one. So interesting to see them together. John Lennon's idea to have the same design for the Get Back album as Please Please Me. So quite a complicated history in terms of how this album was recorded, because they first went into EMI studios on 6th of June 1962 for more or less what was an audition. Pete Best was still on drums. They laid down Love Me Do. George Martin was not happy with the drum sound, said they had to get rid of the drummer. They came back to EMI on the 4th of September with Ringo, recorded a version of Love Me Do, and then they came back on the 11th of September, and George Martin had hired a drummer called Andy White. So the Love Me Do version for the early pressings of the single was the one with Ringo. The one on this album is the one with Andy White, and Ringo is playing tambourine. The single came out on the 5th of October 1962 and got to number 17, I think, in the charts. And then on the 26th of November they laid down the next single, Please Please Me, which had started off as a slow number, kind of Roy Orbison style. George Martin asked them to speed it up, and Ask Me Why, the B-side of that single, was recorded that day as well. Then the single was released on the 11th of Jan, and then on the 11th of Feb, so George Martin figured that he had 4 tracks in the can, the first 2 singles both sides of, So there were 10 more to be recorded. So they went into the studio on the 11th of Feb, Abbey Road Studio, and in the space of a single day laid down 10 tracks, which is absolutely staggering productivity, and you would never see anything the like of it these days. Or even 4 years later, the Beatles took 4 months or 5 months or even 6 months, I think, to record Sgt. Pepper. So to record 10 tracks in a day is just, to this day, it's staggering. And I remember when the 50th anniversary of this album came out, a whole load of artists went into EMI and tried to recreate the same thing by recording the songs in one day. With mixed results. It's not bad. It's quite an interesting documentary. Can't remember the artists who featured on there. Can't remember one. What have we next? Then the album came out on the 22nd of March. And this album, interestingly, the Lennon-McCartney numbers are credited to McCartney-Lennon, which they quickly reversed on with the Beatles in subsequent albums. I think McCartney-Lennon sounds quite right, in the same way that Sullivan and Gilbert doesn't sound right versus Gilbert and Sullivan. So, and then obviously in recent years Paul has tried to get that credit reversed for songs like Hey Jude and Yesterday, which I think is pretty pointless, but anyway. It was McCartney-Lennon on this first album, and I'll go through the tracks. I mean, I Saw Her Standing There is probably one of the best album openers ever, and McCartney's vocal is superb. It's a great rocker. It's one of his true great all-time rockers, and his voice is in great form, which is more than can be said for his ballad voice, which on this album he hadn't quite formulated how he wanted to sing ballads, I don't think, and it wasn't really until And I Love Her on Hard Day's Night when the classic McCartney voice came through on the slower songs. I think he's a little bit unsteady on this album, but not on I Saw Her Standing There. He's an absolutely top form, and it's a brilliant harmony vocal from Lennon towards the chorus. Then the second track is Misery, another Lennon-McCartney or McCartney-Lennon original. Just brilliant in its simplicity, just knocked it off probably pretty quickly, very catchy tune, and very hypnotic word, send her back to me, because everyone can see, without her I will be in misery. Nice piano added by George Martin, and they would struggle to come up with songs as beautifully simple as this. You know, song doesn't need to be terribly complicated to be a great song, and I happen to really rate Misery. I've always loved it. The next song is a cover of Arthur Alexander's Anna, and it's a great version of a great song. And Arthur Alexander also, they covered 2 of his songs for the BBC, Soldier of Love and A Shot of Rhythm and Blues, both of which are brilliant on the BBC sessions. And the Rolling Stones covered You Better Move On from him as well. And this album, Under the Influence, is a great CD because it contains all of the Beatles songs which they covered, but it's got the original versions. So it's got Arthur Alexander's version of Anna, it's got the Marvelettes' version of Please Mr. Postman, and Chuck Berry's version, Roll Over Beethoven, etc. It's worth having, this one. I really enjoy it. One thing interesting here, they could have easily gone back to some of the earlier rock and roll classics and cover versions of their favourites for this debut album. Like, for example, there's no Carl Perkins on here, there's no Elvis, there's no Buddy Holly. Instead, they chose what were pretty current covers, which had come out in the last couple of years. I'd have to check exactly, but for example, Anna was from 1962. Chains, which comes next on the album, sung by George, which is released by the Cookies, is another song from 1962. Boys, which Ringo tackles, is from the Shirelles from 1960. He does a pretty good version of this. It's not my favourite on the album. Ask Me Why is McCartney-Lennon original, the B-side of Please Please Me. It's not bad, but John was to improve his songwriting considerably. This was not a bad start though. Before I get back to the covers, Please Please Me closes side one, and it's just a stunning song. It's a stunning single, stunning vocal harmonies from John and Paul, brilliant harmonica, and George Martin was right to tell them to speed it up, because it would have been a completely different song if it had been a kind of slow Orbison type number. And it's one of my favourite of their early songs. It's brilliant. Love Me Do opens side two, and it has a certain charm. It's not an absolute classic, but again, beautiful in its simplicity. Very hypnotic harmonica from John. Good harmonies, John and Paul. Paul a bit shaky in his solo bit in the middle. Vocal solo bit in the middle, but decent. P.S. I Love You was the B-side, and probably prefer that song to Love Me Do. I think it's a great, not a great song, but it's very nice harmony. You'll see John and Paul sharing a lot of harmony on this album, which was strangely lacking on the second album, comparatively speaking anyway. On this first album, they're singing, their voices blending together on a lot of the tracks, and P.S. I Love You is one of the best examples, particularly in the As I Write This Letter, Send It Back Home to You, Remember That I'm Always Be in Love With You. Brilliant harmony from John there. Then Baby It's You is a cover, again from the Shirelles from 1961. Great vocal from John, he does it well. And they did this on the BBC sessions as well. It was released as a single in '94, I believe. Do You Want to Know a Secret is a Lennon-McCartney song, but they gave it to George to sing. One of two songs which they gave to George to sing, the other being on Hard Day's Night, I'm Happy Just to Dance With You. Prefer this one. Again, very simple, and a great tune. And okay, the words are a little bit, nothing too deep about them, but I like it. They gave it to Billy J. Kramer, who had a massive #1 hit with it. So the Beatles could afford at this stage to give away album tracks as singles, and just release their own stuff as singles. Like From Me to You, the single 3 weeks after this album, was not even on this album, and they maintained that practice throughout the 60s. The singles were generally not on the album, so fans got great value for money. Taste of Honey is Lenny Welch, 1962, another fairly current number. So the mixture of very fresh Lennon-McCartney originals and pretty fresh cover versions of hits of the time. And I guess the impact must have been fantastic, of just going out and buying this album and just putting it on and hearing these harmonies and the energy and the instrumentation. And in many ways it's their best early album, I think. I mean, The Hard Day's Night may be stronger in terms of songwriting, but in terms of sheer energy and passion, this one's hard to beat. Taste of Honey is not my favourite cover version, and Paul's vocal is a little bit shaky, but probably I don't like it mainly because of the song. It's not a great song. There's a Place, Lennon-McCartney original, and again, brilliant harmonies is the first thing you notice, and the other thing you notice is it's probably John's first kind of introspective lyric. There's a place where I can go when I feel low, and it's my mind. And he was later to explore that kind of inward thinking and emotions, and all the psychedelic era later on. Turn Off Your Mind, Relax and Float Downstream, which would be just 3 years after this album. 3.5 years. So there's a place, very, very top-notch Lennon-McCartney early number. And then Twist and Shout, the cover version of the Isley Brothers from 1962. And this song, the Beatles version cuts the original to shreds. The original is good, but this one has such power in the guitars and in Lennon's vocal that it's just, the Beatles made it their own track really. people do think of it as a Beatles track, even though it's a cover. It's so distinctive, the sound and the energy of the early Beatles on this number. They were to do it tremendously successfully in concert, time after time. And I was just thinking, maybe if John had lived and if he'd toured the UK in '81, I can just imagine him with the Double Fantasy Band just opening up with Twist and Shout with Tony Levine on bass. Can you imagine how brilliant that would have been? But was not to be. So that's going through the tracks. I mean, it's a 10 out of 10 album if you want to rank it. All in all, an outstanding debut from this band from Liverpool, who more or less conquered England with this album, and would go on to conquer America the following year and the world shortly thereafter. So thanks for watching.